welcome to Talking Templars. I'm Tony McMahon.
And I'm Dr. Steve Tibble.
And today we're going to be looking at everybody's favourite topic on the Knights Templar. Why were they so brutally crushed from the year 1307, when they were subject to a mass arrest, through to 1312, when they were officially banned by the Pope, and then 1314, when the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, Jacques de Molay, was incinerated, burned at the stake, near to Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. And there is a small plaque that it's very difficult to find. I think the Parisians are still quite ashamed.
Yeah, well, it's no coincidence on the island of the Jews. The Ile des Juifs is sort of, it is, redolent of repression.
Yes, repression and a very sad history in the city of people who've been persecuted, and the Templars certainly added to that. So let's start with everybody's favourite date as well, Friday the 13th. First of all, is it true that the arrest warrants were served, we're told, Friday the 13th, 1307? They'd been prepared a month before, in secret. The King of France, King Philip IV of France, called the Fair, though I think that may be in reference not to his fairness, but some other aspect of
beauty.
Yes. So he, with his notorious advisor Guillaume de Nogaret, they prepare these warrants. They accuse the Templars of all kinds of stuff, which we'll go into, some pretty salacious stuff, and then they serve the warrants. Now the Templars are taken completely by surprise, are they not? Why does the King of France conduct a mass arrest of the Knights Templar? Why does that happen?
Yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, there's really, I guess there's two main reasons. One is that the Templars are redundant. You know, the Crusades effectively ground to a close, and not a successful one from the Christian point of view. So the Templars are seen as having been the losers. You know, they had one job to do, and that was to save the Holy Land, and they haven't done that. So on the one hand, you've got the loss and failure. On the other hand, you have redundancy. You know, this is a rich organization with a lot of quite famously arrogant people who are now without a job. And as we'll maybe talk about later, in the case of dear Jacques de Molay, it's unfortunate they're being led by a really old school, dyed-in-the-wool military guy who's got the imagination of my left elbow, and I'm sure not even that in your case. Yeah. He's a unimaginative, inflexible leader. He's the wrong man in the wrong place.
Just a quick Templar ad break now to tell you about Downfall of the Templars by Tony McMahon. This book covers the thrilling events around the trials of the Knights Templar in 1307, leading up to the execution of the last Grand Master in 1314. Make sure to get your copy at Amazon, Waterstones and other outlets. I mean, to summarise what's happened in the Holy Land, which I'm sure our audience will know off by heart, but just to be clear, they've lost... they took Jerusalem in 1099, they lost it in 1187, they did kind of get it back later, but then they lose it again. But basically the Crusaders have been pushed back and back and back and back. The new power in the region is the Mamluks, ex-slaves who've taken over Egypt. They are ruthless under their military leader Baybars. He takes no prisoners. They're forced right way back to Acre. They lose Acre on the mainland, and eventually they're basically sulking on the island of Cyprus. So, like you say, they've lost the Holy Land. Their whole raison d'etre is gone. They have, of course, gained what we now call Spain and Portugal in the Reconquista, but that doesn't really count because it's the holy places, Jerusalem and so on. And then I think the Pope actually proposes at one point a merger of the Templars and the Hospitallers. And as you say about the egos, that doesn't work. The Templars in particular turn that down in no uncertain terms.
Yeah, very much so.
Does that kind of seal their fate, do you think?
I think it really does. Ironically, the merger does happen, but it's a merger of assets rather than individuals. And when the Templars are suppressed, a lot of their guys do go into the Templar Institute, into Hospitaller institution. So the merger happens by default, but it happens in the most bloody way. And the trouble was that Jacques de Molay and the Templars were so bloody minded that, faced with obvious redundancy, their only way forward, the thing they were calling for, was a huge crusade when tens of thousands of horsemen and infantry would be shipped across the Mediterranean and force their way back into the Middle East. Even though, and even with, many huge castles, they hadn't been able to do it while they were over there. They thought that they could just go back in and fight their way back in. And it was completely incredible. Nobody really was buying what they had to sell. Yeah. So they're redundant, and all their only alternative, all they can talk about is, give me my old job back. The clever thing the Hospitallers did was to find out a new job. They had their work helping the sick, helping the poor, and they also started to become a maritime power, so they could contest the rise of Islam in the Eastern Mediterranean by sea, which is inevitable because they were no longer on land, and they took that imaginative step. The Templars were really hardcore, and they were way too rigid. And dear old Jacques, just led them. He just painted them into a corner. He was saying, really, we don't want to merge, we don't want to do anything. Just give us huge resources, and we'll have a go at doing what we failed to do for 200 years.
And he kind of says what I suppose a lot of it's a very kind of almost like army canteen point of view. He kind of says, if only we'd had the right resources, we'd have won that battle. It's those politicians back home. It's that kind of shtick. Yeah. But I think it's, there's a kind of a change going on, isn't there? Because at the start of the First Crusade, it's the peak of papal power. Popes have never been so powerful, and they can command kings to do their will. They're pretty easy with the excommunications at that time, and when they command a crusade, and this whole concept of the crusade, they can rally Europe. By the early 1300s, you've got kings like Philip and other kings around Europe who are beginning to think, actually, they're almost becoming nationalists in their kind of. We can't stretch that too far, but they're beginning to think, I run my turf, not the Pope. I don't like having these armed bodies of men on my soil who I don't run because they were directly accountable to the Pope. And as a matter of fact, I don't like the fact they're sitting on loads of money that I could be using because I'm fighting England at the moment, and that could be rather useful. So it's incipient. Exactly. I kind of find incipient nationalism almost kind of foreshadowing the Reformation, even to a degree.
Yeah, I mean, there is always that tension between church and state and all of that, and again, I think the redundancy of the Crusades having finished, effectively, it was game over. Some people like the Templars didn't accept defeat, but if you were, your peasant in the gutter, you would see that as obviously they've been beaten, and. Interestingly, though, the Templars were actually suppressed in the middle of the call for a crusade. The Pope and the kings of Europe were trying to organise some kind of crusade, and the Templars and the Hospitallers were at the forefront of organising that, and the Italians as well. But even with all that going on, you have to look at the particularity of King Philip. So. Although there were these incipient forces of church and state and all of that, in other countries like England, say, that didn't lead to suppression. The Templars were still widely respected. They were at court. They were doing, good work. They were close advisors to the king. So you have to look at what made France different, and in that you have to look, I think, at firstly dear Philip, and you have to look at the methodologies that the French crown had got used to using to get money.
Well, and I think I've explored this. Let's promote our own books.
Go on then.
Yeah. But in a book I've got out this year, Downfall of the Templars, I was kind of very struck by. It definitely. I think he did manage to extract money out of the Templars. There's a lot of people say, we turned up and the cupboard was bare. But actually, it's not my research, but there's research that's been done by a couple of mainstream historians who've certainly done a good job trying to show that the Exchequer did benefit. They did manage to extract some money out of the Templars. But also, Philip, the reason I find Philip intriguing, one French historian called it the pontificalization of the French monarchy, the Capuchin dynasty. Yeah. They did think they had a phone line to God, but also I think Philip No, you can disagree with me. You're allowed to.
No, no, no.
I think he genuinely does buy into some of this sorcery, witchcraft,
Yeah, I agree.
heresy
I
stuff.
agree.
He's got a group of women called the Beguines on trial. He's trying to basically put a dead Pope, Boniface VIII, on trial for diabolism, who, when this Pope was alive, he had him beaten up by his own thugs who went down there and did that. He's even accusing a bishop of having poisoned the Queen with spells and blah, blah. I think Philip's a bit... he buys into some of this stuff as well. For those of you lucky enough to live in the United Kingdom, Templar history is all around you. Dr. Steve Tibble looks at the knights who made Britain. The evidence is in the landscape, it's in town names, it's in the very fibre of our being as Britons. So find out all about the Knights Templar in Britain. Get your copy on Amazon, Waterstones, and other outlets.
And human beings, we're complicated, and we can run parallel conflicting ideas in our heads. And I think you can make a very good case for saying that Philip was genuinely greedy, genuinely power-seeking, but at the same time genuinely gullible and believing a lot of his own propaganda. And I think that does work very uncomfortably. And the Templars were victims of that. But I think, as you say, there are other victims as well. And when you look at the methodology of the French monarchy, they do have this compelling juxtaposition of greed, gullibility, and the power to put those things into action. And so the key thing is, if you look above the Templars and you look at what the monarchy did, you find that the Jewish community had been rounded up, they'd had all their money extracted, and then they'd been expelled. The Italian bankers had been rounded up, they'd had their money extorted from them, and after Philip died, his son did much the same with the lepers. People discovered that the lepers had been conspiring to poison all the water wells of France, and in conjunction with Muslims and Jews, which was kind of crazy because there weren't any there, but it didn't stop them coming up with this kind of crazy conspiracy theory. The key thing is that they'd found a way to get marginalized groups or vulnerable groups, accuse them of anything crazy, and then extort money from them, and it worked very well. It doesn't mean that you don't believe your own propaganda, but you can see that as a mechanism, it's quite compelling.
And I think you see it reflected in the charges. I mean, the warrant is so ridiculous. I mean, from our point of view, they talk about them spitting on crucifixes, worshipping demonic heads and cats, and kissing each other on the base of the spine. But a lot of that stuff, I mean, in the next century, we'll see the witchcraft trials take off. When, witchcraft previously, in the early Middle Age, has been regarded as something that happened with old women in villages, and the church was like, well, we're not interested because it's not true. But in the 1200s, 1300s, you kind of see the church blending. They're sexing up heresy charges with a bit of witchcraft and sorcery because it's good for PR. And it makes it harder for people like the Templars to fight back. I mean, when you're being accused of being in league with Satan and crucifying Christ a second time, how do you argue against that in court in the Middle Ages?
No, it's like, when did you stop beating your wife? It is that whole thing. You've been tarred with the crazy charge. Whether you say yes or no, it doesn't really matter. I think one thing that has been a lot of modern research has proven is that a lot of the charges were not just concocted, but they were literally kind of cut and paste. That a lot of the French advisors have gone back through the filing cabinets to find out what heretics were accused of. So heretics even like 100 years earlier in Germany or what have you, and they just effectively cut and paste these crazy charges, and which is why there's a whole load of sort of accusations of same-sex activity going on, because that was seen as antisocial behaviour, and heretics are the ultimate antisocial group. So you combine the two together. So you bring in a bit of, gay action. You bring in a bit of Satanism. You throw a little bit of magic into the pot, and so on. And you've got this powerful, 100% concocted sort of set of charges. But it's very difficult, the mud sticks. You chuck enough of it at them, and it's very difficult to argue against it. Plus, you've got the other important and often underestimated subject, which is torture. So in the French judiciary, they've got the power of torture. basically they can torture people into confessing to anything and everything, which many Templars do, and many Templars die under torture or are burnt because they refuse to admit these trumped up charges. So it's a dreadful.
And you've got to kind of change. Well, going back to the what we call the Cathar heresy and so on, you've got the church kind of loosening up in its attitude to the use of torture for decades before. So a lot of the kind of what happens to Templars is kind of rehearsed with other groups of heretics, and it's astonishing actually how many heresies they were. And I suppose as the popes had become more powerful, so had resistance. And you do have, you kind of have the Franciscans who are brought into the church, but the Waldensians who remain outside, Cathars, and then there's all these amazing. I found one the other day, a woman called Guglielma in northern Italy, who claimed that she was going to install a female pope and feminize the Gospels, and actually got quite a lot of support from the local nobility and even the local church until the Pope sent the Dominicans in to sort it out.
And they realised they'd made a tragic mistake.
They made a terrible mistake, and some people had to be burned for that.
Yeah.
But there is a lot of heresy going on. The church has been spooked out. And so the Templars, although the Templars themselves haven't done anything heretical,
no.
I mean, no. But the charges are there ready-made to be thrown at them.
No,
basically.
But you're absolutely right. I mean, you raised the issue of structure, really. Basically the Inquisition is now out there. Torture is now a key weapon in this toolbox. So it's all in place. If you combine that with the kind of monarchy's methodology of getting cash when they're feeling a bit cash strapped, it's very easy. And if you compare it with countries like England or Cyprus, where there's no tradition of heresy, so there's no tradition of Inquisition, and ergo there's no tradition of torture, none of the Templars confess to anything because the charges are crazy. So why would they confess to something they haven't done? But in France, where the opposite is true, people are tortured into admitting the lot.
We have to look at obviously the role of Pope Clement V, who cuts a rather tragic figure. I know he's always kind of portrayed as a pope under the thumb of the King of France, so I think it was more complex than that. He does try to assert the church's dignity, let alone independence.
Yes,
and he's not actually. I think people sometimes make the mistake of assuming that he wasn't in Rome. He was in Avignon, effectively in exile. But Avignon wasn't part of France as such. I believe it was part of the Holy Roman Empire, which kind of made a difference. But the way he responds is he essentially drags his feet. He keeps this thing going for as long as possible. He constantly tries to reassert church control, but he's fighting a losing battle.
Yeah.
Philip he only has to look at what happened to a previous pope to know that Philip is more than capable of beating popes up physically, literally. Yeah. He's in an invidious position, isn't he?
Absolutely. I mean, a bit like Jacques de Molay, wrong place, wrong time. He's a weak pope with a weak hand of cards, playing a weak game. And actually, in a way, for the way we look at the Templars now, that's really the key to how it all happens. They are in modern culture. They're part of things like Assassin's Creed, and they fit into Assassin's Creed so well because they were suppressed with this aura with this taint of magic and sorcery and Satanism. So there is this kind of arcane element to them that was only allowed to take place and to install itself in their memory because a weak papacy wasn't able to defend them. And in fairness to Clement, I mean, he wasn't great and he did have a weak hand, but he effectively, put in train the merger that everybody had been talking about because he did push back against Philip to the extent that he said, well, the Templars' properties should be given to the Hospitallers. And, in all over Europe, the existing Templar Knights, Templar Brothers, in many cases just migrated, and they just had a brand change and moved into Hospitaller Priories.
And you see in Portugal, obviously, the king takes a different tack. I mean, he's still effectively taking over Templar property, which is obviously a lot of the nobility wanted to do that to get back what they donated over the years. But You get the feeling a lot of kings around Europe. I mean, I think when I say King Edward II wrote a letter to the King of Castile saying, "I just don't get what Philip's up to." I mean, they were a bit sort of like, "What the hell's going on here?" But then they all kind of fall into line. But like you say, I mean, in England, in Castile, they're not so into the idea of torturing the Templars. They don't mind pensioning them off and or subsuming them into other organisations, but they don't really want to get the thumbs screws out. It really is France that really, the moment they've arrested them, they're racking them, burning them, and God knows what else.
It's a cash grab in France, I think, and in the rest of Europe, people are forced to go along with it. In Portugal and Spain, they're still fighting their own version of the crusade, so they need those resources for that action. And in the rest of Europe, I think there's just incredulity. I don't think people really believed it. But actually, by the time the process had gone through, I think even the papacy, eventually acquitted them because they were innocent. But the brand is so tarnished that it's irredeemable, and because their archives were lost in the years to come, they've become this kind of cipher, really, this kind of tabula rasa that we can place whatever conspiracies or fantasy video games we feel like we can impose them.
Well, I mean, you've touched on it, obviously, with the rise of Freemasonry in the 18th century, I suppose various kind of Satanist and other esoteric movements in the 19th century, Theosophy and so on, 20th century Satanism as well. There's been a kind of, the Templars really have, the story of the crushing of the Templars has been a feeding frenzy, really, for esoteric and conspiracy theory merchants, and still remains so. So, I guess I have to ask you, Steve, did they worship Baphomet?
Well, they were surprised. I think the key thing was right at the very beginning, you said they were genuinely surprised, and I think that's true. All the evidence is that the guys were rounded up and they were surprised. They had no time to dispose of their goods. And yet, all the monarchies across Europe conducted very thorough kind of surveys of what items they had, partly because there was an element of cash grab about it. And anybody looking for satanic statues would have been sorely disappointed. Anybody looking for crucifixes that had been damaged by being kicked around the room before they were urinated on, would have been disappointed because they weren't there. What they did find were the most conservative, old school sets of religious icons. Very boring books because the guys weren't great readers. They were very old school. So it's very conservative reading materials and the normal kind of religious items that you'd expect. So it's one reason why I think, particularly in France, all the evidence of the inventories wasn't ever used in the trials, because what it did say was exactly the opposite of what the French king wanted to say. It said, this is a bunch of conservative, pious, rather unimaginative guys who've sadly got money that I want to take off them.
Yeah, so I mean, it is. I mean, we'll return to some of the kind of, obviously some of the more esoteric themes. I mean, I'm writing a book at the moment on the relationship between Freemasonry and the Templars, which, is fascinating, even if, we can doubt whether or not a lot of it is actually grounded in truth. But it's, as you say, it's what people have made the Templars, and because of the astonishing way in which they were crushed and the very kind of salacious accusations and so on. Yeah,
I think it all says a lot more about us. I think the manner of their suppression says a lot more about Philip than it does about the Templars. And I think the conspiracies we have today say a lot more about us and our need to find, external control in the absence of, the piety that the people had in the Middle Ages. I think it's a wonderful thing, and that's why we're still talking about it.
No, I've actually got to go away and worship a demon shortly myself. Yes, I may Lord Baphomet continue to serve us. But I'm afraid to say that is the end of this episode. We're going to come back to elements of this, and we are going to explore some of the esoteric stuff, but also a lot more of the mainstream stuff, or what actually did happen in those trials, drill down a bit more into it, because, we need to talk about that poor Templar who turned up with his toe bones at one trial.
Absolutely.
After having his feet burned off. But, stuff like that. We'll come back to some of the stuff that I know some of these sicker people
close to all our hearts,
want to hear about. But in the meantime, it's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
And non nobis domine.